innovation versus budget cuts. So the sort of opposing forces that a lot of people are sort of experiencing right now. And there's a need and a want from most organizations to continue pushing innovation and being competitive and finding new ways to make breakthroughs. But at the same time, there's lots of talk about budget cuts and needing to trim expenses, that type of thing. And so what we want to talk about today is sort of this innovation versus budget cuts concept. Before we dive into that, just a little bit about me. For those of you that don't know me, my name's Jeff Francis. I'm one of the co-founders of ENO8. We're a digital product studio located here in Dallas, Texas. I've been in the space a long time, probably been involved with more than 200 digital product launches over my career. So seen a lot, learned a lot, and hopefully have some nuggets to share with you guys today that will help you with wherever you are with sort of your digital and innovation initiatives. So let's just dive right in. So the first point here is this time of the year is budget season for a lot of folks. I realize that not every company has a fiscal year that starts in October, but even if you don't, this time of the year is often when conversations start coming up about forecasting for the next year, for 2024. And so you're trying to set budgets, trying to pick priorities, trying to allocate money. So we figured this would be a good time for us to kind of visit this topic. So for you and your organization, what are you prioritizing for next year? Do you want to invest in innovation, but maybe scared about the economic climate or the potential for a slowdown in the economic environment going into next year? Do you have maybe executives or investors or leadership that is that you're needing to sort of sell on initiatives that you think are worthy of pursuing? Are you getting a lot of pressure perhaps from those different stakeholders I just mentioned, but you don't want to sort of surrender market share, or surrender your progress or your ability to be ahead of the competition? So how do we balance those things? So one point that I wanted to cover here is that innovation doesn't have to equal moonshots. I think a lot of times the public perception of innovation often looks like, Alphabet's moonshots, completely out of left field, could be revolutionary, big in scale, but they might also burn a few $1 billion without actually having a tangible result to show for it. Or even if there is a result, it may be really far off in the future. That may be fine for a $1.5 trillion company, but most companies can't afford these huge swings where they're sort of betting the farm on a single initiative, right? Something of that scale. So one thought is that you can benefit from sort of changing your frame of reference, right? That you can innovate without having to completely revolutionize your entire industry. You can still make huge gains against competitors without sinking massive sums of money into sort of an innovation effort. And you really don't have to spend years in R&D and tons of cash to build an innovative product in a lot of cases, in most cases, right? And so start by sort of reframing what is innovation, what is considered innovation, and how attainable it might be for your size organization, right? Next one I had here is about narrowing your focus. When you're constrained on resources or when budgets are tightening, you probably have fewer shots, right? Fewer things that your company can invest in or pursue. And so one of the things you have to keep in mind is you have to be much more intentional about what are those shots that you're going to take, right? So, being intentional about prioritization, also means that you don't want to take on something that's going to derail other really important priorities, right? So being clear about what those priorities are, and then sort of where does this fit into that overall sort of priority picture becomes even more important, right? And then, don't forget to make sure that as you're doing these priorities, you're being really clear about how do these priorities tie to organizational goals, right? And I'll talk about that in a couple of minutes later on how important that becomes when you're trying to enroll stakeholders. We try to think about these initiatives and don't get too caught up on this is really cool, we can do this, can it be done, and forget about why you're doing it, right? So tied to organizational goals, be really clear about the prioritization picture. And the focus of these innovation efforts really need to be in lockstep with the overall sort of corporate or business objectives. And think here like you want to make a clear P&L case, right? How do you trace that sort of real impact on the bottom line, right? The next one is make sure you have a plan, right? So if you're pitching an innovation effort or project, you need to really have a detailed plan that speaks to the overall business objectives. And so if you're trying to secure funding for a project, especially in a turbulent economic environment or a sort of frightened economic environment, your plan needs to be really rock solid. And so some examples of things that might be part of a good plan would be, is it realistic, right? Is it clear? Is it well researched, right? Do you have sort of some good grounding behind why you would make the recommendation? Make sure to present an unimpeachable business case, right? Something that really makes sense, that people feel like can have an impact, right? Have a clear relationship to bottom line results, which I mentioned a second ago. And, another plan is getting secured buy-in from key stakeholders before you do your formal presentation, right? Especially if it's in a group, right? I find that it's good to sort of go win over those individual stakeholders one-on-one before you really try to win everyone over in some sort of a more formal or group type of setting, right? Another part of a detailed plan is something I talk a ton about. I refer to it as validation gates. In an environment where your resources are being cut or constrained, you need to be crystal clear about these validation gates. They may need to happen more frequently, right? So you may want to try to chop them up so that they're a little bit smaller, shorter, and you're sort of getting that information sooner so that you can kind of proceed as you get validation, right? And so they need to be crystal clear. They need to have timelines associated to them. They need to have clear objectives that you're trying to achieve. Ideally, they've got a pretty clear way of being able to measure those objectives, or that you're attaining those objectives for each one of those gates, right? And so this next one along that lines is sort of the flip side of a validation gate. I think of a validation gate as something that we're stating is something that we want to prove or validate, so that when we get there, we can evaluate it, and then with good data decide to proceed and continue, right? The flip side of that coin is an off-ramp. So you need to have validation gates and you need to have off-ramps. And so off-ramp is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. At each one of these gates, it needs to be a potential off-ramp. If you missed the gate, or your hypothesis proved to not be true, or you're just super off track, right? Beyond sort of an acceptable margin of error, you want to make sure that you're willing to take the off-ramp, right? And I think in most cases, colleagues and stakeholders will respect that you had clear validation gates. And even if you get to that and you prove that we didn't achieve this validation gate, we're going to take the off-ramp. I think there's some respect and trust that gets built from even seeing you take that choice to sort of pull the plug on something. So, if you think about like missing validation gates, like this isn't like hard and fast rules, right? So I said earlier, an acceptable margin of effort. So if you're a week late, and you can probably still hit the gate, right? In most cases, if you're within 5% of your budget, you can still probably proceed, right? But if you're 3 months behind, or 50% over budget, or targeting 50% over budget, and it's not looking like it's going to even land within users, or it doesn't look like it's going to land on the business objective, you're not getting the feedback and the validation confirmation that you were hoping for, it's probably time to take the off-ramp, right? So these type of intermittent goals, like shorter goals with off-ramps, give executives a lot of transparency. Like I said, it makes you accountable, makes the team accountable, And it gives both of you an opportunity to cut bait if you're not on target or you're not on budget without burning a whole lot more cash or time or focus and resources unnecessarily. So all parts of a really good plan, right? This one sounds super obvious, but make the ask, right? I hear this a lot in sort of the context of sales. It's like how many sales are lost because the salesperson didn't ask for the sale, kind of thing. It's a similar thing here, right? Like don't let fear stand in the way of making the ask. If you're prepared, you got a solid foundation behind sort of what you're recommending. You have a lot of clarity about how you would approach it. Then don't be afraid to make the ask, right? So, I know it's tough, especially in today's environment, to ask for funding in sort of a belt tightening phase, but you also never know what's going to happen if you don't make the ask, right? So, if your plan has everything that we listed earlier on that last slide, then there's a non-zero chance you get it approved. But if you don't ask, then you're definitely not going to get anything. And so make the ask. Last thought on this one is, even if you don't get the funding, for Q1 or Q2 of 2024, if you've made a well-researched, well-presented, and sort of bottom line impacting pitch, you're more likely to secure funding when budgets do loosen up, right? So the earlier you can make a compelling pitch or presentation or case, the more likely that will get done at some point. So even if it doesn't happen immediately, still may have set the stage where it can happen when things sort of start to free up a little bit. Moving on. So I called this one, there's a different way. So innovation doesn't just mean hiring, a big four consulting firm. There are many other models. So in really large organizations, sometimes the traditional path is to do a really large engagement with a really big firm, and just the sort of assessment phase can get really costly. So what I encourage you to do is be open to thinking about other ways that you can sort of achieve the goals, maybe in smaller bite-sized elements, and you don't have to go this sort of big consulting route necessarily to get there. So as an example, our innovation lab is pretty bite-sized. It's about 6 weeks. It covers a lot of the bases that really set a good foundation for giving you clarity, so you can just make better informed decisions, right? And so things that could be included in this would be, certain types of documentation. It might be things like being clear on what sort of what we call the MLP element of the product or the initiative, the minimum lovable product. It could be things like a design prototype, right? It's one of my favorites. I talk about it all the time. One of my favorite artifacts is a design prototype, just because it really helps align people who may not sort of speak the same language. And so prototypes, getting good clarity on costing, right? Like once you do a little bit more homework, got your hands around it a little bit better, then chances are you're going to have a much better chance of hitting the sort of budgets that you're looking at or you're working with, and the timelines, right? And so by sort of like shortening this up, go with something a little bit more bite-sized, you're able to prove out your concept, go through these validation gates, right? And then you can sort of see like a clear and achievable roadmap without sort of sinking moonshot money into an idea, right? So some benefits here: faster timeline. I think of it as up or out. A lot of times these initiatives sort of sit around. They're things that get talked about, but there's nothing happening to either decide, like, are we going to move on with this? Is it going to go up, or are we moving it out and we're going to stop sort of considering it, right? So so a few thoughts there, where you don't have to do these sort of huge engagements to vet these concepts. In most cases, you can shrink it down, take a step that's small, get good data, and then kind of move on to the next step, right? And the last one here that I'll kind of wrap up with is admittedly a little more future looking. So create a culture of innovation, right? So this isn't something that can be done overnight. You're not going to go in and give a presentation and now you're going to have a culture of innovation and people understand it and adopt it and embrace it. It may take something that takes some time, if that's not already sort of hardwired into your culture of your company. So, a couple of thoughts. Companies that do innovate effectively, they already have it baked into their culture, right? And so, if you don't already have that, the best time to start is today, right? You don't have to go from a tried and true type of shop to an innovative one overnight. It takes time. It takes commitment to innovation as sort of a core value that's adopted by, all the different key stakeholders. And, even in that situation, none of that can happen without someone or maybe a group of someone's pushing it and constantly selling it, being the cheerleader and an advocate for it, right? Educating about it. And then, culture is created. It's something that if you are intentional, it's something you've picked, it's something that's a priority, it can be created. So, think about within a business, what you value and reward in your company sort of reflects your culture. So if you want to build a culture of innovation, you really have to live it. You have to find a way to align incentives and decisions and even the people with that sort of culture of innovation and what looks like in real life, right? Last thought here is that if you're trying to make your company more innovative, you need to have that ambassador of innovation. And if that's not you, it has to be someone, right? This approach of sort of trying to build or embrace or grow a culture of innovation, again, doesn't happen overnight. It's not going to happen where it's going to make the impact for getting you funded in the next quarter, but it could lay the groundwork so that future projects and future initiatives get a better, different look, more open-mindedness, and you guys will be in a position where you can sort of pursue those initiatives later on a little bit more easily. So I'll open it up some questions. I know, Jordan, we usually have a handful of them that get submitted before. So it looks like you're throwing those in the chat. I'll just kind of read a few of these that we have gotten already. And by the way, if you have other questions or thoughts on this, then feel free to throw that in the Q&A window. I can pick those up too. We got done pretty quick today, so I think we're on time. First question I had here was, what are some ways to get stakeholders aligned on innovation priorities? Some of it I talked about a little bit earlier. A big one is have clarity on what your hypothesis is, right? Like, what is the base assumption underneath what you're proposing that sort of has to be true in order for this to be a success, right? So think about success criteria. Think about, how does this tie to organizational goals? How does it tie to bottom line? Those kinds of things is where my mind goes in terms of aligning people. But just identifying that stuff isn't good enough. There's a big communication element of this that's really important, this consensus building sort of concept, right? And I find that a lot of people who are leading innovation or people who are sort of like in that product role, one of the skills that the ones that are really good have is that they're great consensus builders, they're great communicators, and they can kind of sell the dream, right? And part of being able to sell the dream is that you're convinced yourself of the dream, right? So if you believe it yourself, then that goes a long way to helping you sort of convince others. The other one here that I would talk about is that you've been able to paint a picture, and maybe you use sort of a plan like I talked about earlier, but telling a story and creating a picture where you can sort of present that to others, get them on your team, get them behind it. And then as that group grows, then you can kind of go make sort of the formal request. So getting stakeholders aligned, I think, is largely about aligning around the vision or the premise behind what you're trying to propose. We had a second question here that is, what would you consider a bite-sized innovation process? I mean, if you think about, when Google Ventures really pioneered a lot of the design thinking sort of concepts, they did design sprints. Those were like 1 week sprints or maybe 2 week sprints, I think. They can be pretty small. The issue that I've seen is that in organizations where the team is not solely focused on one sort of initiative, it's rather difficult to get all of those people all during the same week with 100% focus on something. That can be kind of challenging with conflicting schedules and priorities. So one of the things that we do is we spread it out a little bit, right? Like we don't try to tackle it all in 1 week. Usually ours are 4 to 6 weeks, but it's not requiring sort of dedicated attention from everybody involved during that whole period. So you can sort of have a timeline. You can make it short enough where you can achieve a lot, get a lot of clarity during that time period, but it doesn't completely pause any other priorities or initiatives that you're working on at the time. And so the other one there that could help, if you don't have this kind of capability in-house, looking at partners, done for you sometimes is better than trying to do it yourself, especially if you're trying to quickly arrive at sort of a decision. So I think some of the feedback that we've gotten in the past about our innovation lab is that it's nice because we do work with the client team, and there's a lot of discovery and sort of workshops and things like that are involved, but we largely go away and create the deliverables and then kind of come back with that. And so a lot of our clients have sort of used that as almost a vetting process to say, hey, here's something we think that might be worth us pursuing. We want to put it to an innovation lab. And at the end of that period, at the end of that 4 to 6 weeks period, you end up with something that's pretty clear about this is worth pursuing. What's the main value here? How are we going to achieve? How are we going to measure success? What does it look like to actually tackle this in terms of budget and resources and that type of thing? So I think a bite-sized innovation process could be something as short as a single day workshop, even in some cases. But generally speaking, I would see it in like a 4 to 6 week period, unless you have the ability to sort of like focus everybody solely on that for a short amount of time, maybe a week or two. So I think that's the only questions that I saw. So good. I think we hit time. Just a couple of notes to everyone. Looks like we got some new faces that I haven't seen on one of our previous sessions. So thank you guys for joining us. If you've got questions on this topic or even other topics that perhaps you'd like to hear us talk about in the future, we'd love to hear back from you and get that feedback. So drop us an email at info@ENO8.com, or I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, so you could drop me a direct message on LinkedIn. There's my link there, or you can just search. I'm pretty easy to find there, I think. If I mentioned our innovation lab a little bit and a couple of the slides. If you want some more information on that, or to get a better idea of what is that, what does it look like, how does it kind of fit in the picture, go to our website, eno8.com/innovation-lab. I've got some pretty cool information out there. I think there's a pretty good video that'll give you an overview. Yeah, I would love to get feedback on this. If you agree with our stuff that we presented today, or you don't agree with it, just the same, would love to hear back from you and get the feedback. We appreciate that. And we'll see you on our next session. Thanks, everyone.